Excellent. Hey, everybody. This is Nate McGaha. I'm the executive director of Arts North Carolina, and it is my absolute pleasure to be doing this webinar with you today. It's what the federal and state is happening. And I will say that uh, that we are gonna get to the state budget updates, but we've got a lot of federal things to go over today. For those of you that can't see me, I'm a middle-aged white man, bald with glasses, wearing a blue shirt, and also with a background of
Okay, Nate. Nate, you have to unmute because I
sorry
had to
about
mute
that.
everybody.
Got
Somebody
it.
had a.
If everybody can please stay muted, and keep your cameras off for the sake of better streaming. And we will get going for our webinar today. So, a brief disclaimer: I am not a lawyer, so I am definitely not your lawyer. So this webinar should not be considered legal advice. Just an update on what's going on based on our research. I'm going to start talking about the federal budget and where that stands as of right now. We'll dive into our cultural agencies at the federal first: Museum, Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, National Endowment for the Humanities, and National Endowment for the Arts. I will do a recap of some of the bigger things that might be affecting the arts from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We'll talk a little bit about immigration and ticketing at the federal level. We'll talk about executive orders and actions, and then we will talk about North Carolina budget and North Carolina policy updates as they affect the arts. So, like a lot to cover, so we will just go ahead and dive on in. So the good news is that we are seeing some budget bills that are passing, and actually, so a couple weeks ago, the House passed HR 6938, which allocated level or near level funding to a lot of cultural agencies: Endowment for the Arts, Endowment for the Humanities, the Kennedy Center, which is what it was called in the bill. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Smithsonian, etc. The vote was 397 to 28. All the North Carolina representatives that were voting that day supported this bill. Then the U.S. Senate passed it the following week with a strong vote of 82 to 15, very bipartisan. Both North Carolina senators supported the bill. And last Friday, President Trump signed that into law. So our cultural agencies are officially funded, with the exception of IMLS. Also, the support for arts education that we typically track: Title One, Title Two, Title 4A, assistance for arts education, etc. That is in a different bill. And you're like, Nate, what's with the question marks in the yellow? Well, it is in process. So the House has passed it, 341 to 88. Two representatives did not support the bill. It was one Democrat and one Republican. I don't recall exactly what their issues were with it, but it is on to the Senate side. It is expected to pass. But right now it's been moved for cloture, but the cloture vote, that's what they need, the 60 votes to continue on, so that they can actually get a vote. So that has been moved. I don't think this is going to be held up. However, this bill came up with another bill, 7149, that funds the Department of Homeland Security as well as ICE. And because of recent events, there's a big push to stop that bill, which is separate. So watching that very closely, and so we're expecting IMLS and the education to be funded soon. Continuing resolution expires on Friday, on the 30th. So should we not get passage today, then we will then some parts of the federal government would shut down, not all. Unless we get another continuing resolution for those parts or they pass those sections of the budget. As you can see, these are the ones that got final approval on the House and the Senate and been signed. You can see 207 for the NEA and NEH. Smithsonian doing well. All of the ones that are in green, except for the Kennedy Center, though, do note that the Kennedy Center did get a significant amount, an additional 257 million back in July. So while they might not have seen as much funding in the budget as they did in FY25, they also received this additional funding. So lots of really great news there. But then in terms of those things that haven't been funded quite yet, and we're hoping soon, we'll see IMLS took a little bit of a haircut, but not too much. Lots of green. Obviously, the big red line that goes all the way across the budget is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I think we're all aware at this point that agency was defunded because of a rescission package in, I think it was June of 2025, and has voted to end its existence. So moving on from the budget, let's talk a little bit about IMLS. Let's go back to the spring, kind of remember what happened to the IMLS in the beginning so we can put that into some context for what's going on now. It was listed in an executive order to eliminate IMLS as well as others to the maximum legal extent. Deputy Secretary Keith Sonderling became the acting IMLS director. The entire IMLS staff was placed on administrative leave for up to 90 days. They started canceling grants across IMLS. Quite a few termination notices were sent to all but 12 staff. And all 23 members of the National Museum and Library Service Board, which is like their board of directors, were fired. And then that's when the lawsuits came into play. And this is really a tale of two lawsuits, and it does have a happy ending. First, 21 states attorneys general filed a lawsuit claiming that the actions against IMLS were illegal several times over. And then just a few days later, the American Library Association filed a lawsuit along with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. The judge from the ALA lawsuit, the American Library Association lawsuit, issued a temporary restraining order, and then there was a preliminary injunction from the 21 state AG's lawsuit. The staff was then allowed to return to work. Some grants were restored. Then in June, a judge allowed grant terminations from the ALA lawsuit while that proceeded, but the staff stayed. And then in November, the court, the judge in the case brought by the 21 state attorneys general, permanently blocked the dismantling of the agency, which was really great news, ordered IMLS to restore all the grants and all the staff. And then a week later, IMLS put out a notice that they were reinstating all their terminated grant. And upon further review was the reason that they gave, is that they further reviewed the situation, and it was just a very brief statement. Current staffing information is not entirely available on their website, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later on as well. Also, the National Endowment for the Humanities, going in the Wayback Machine to March, the NEH chair, Lowe, was asked to step down by the president. The National Endowment for the Humanities General Counsel, Michael McDonald, became the acting, that should say NEH chair, not NEA chair. Also, then shortly thereafter, beginning of April, as many as 65% of the staff was placed on indefinite administrative leave. Over 1,000 NEH grants were terminated, including all nonprofit state humanities councils grants. That's devastating. Not unlike the National Endowment for the Arts, every state has a humanities council, but unlike the National Endowment for the Arts and the North Carolina Arts Council, all those humanities councils are nonprofits. So they lost their funding. However, the Mellon Foundation stepped up, committed $15 million to try and offset some of those cuts to the humanities councils. And they received $250,000 immediately, plus $50,000 in matching to the North Carolina Humanities Council. So that was kind of a respite. Then there was a lawsuit. American Council of Learned Societies, as well as the American Historical Association and the Modern Language Association, filed a federal lawsuit challenging the dismantling of the National Endowment for Humanities. The judge did put out an order basically saying that amongst other things, that the funds could not be reallocated to other parts of the federal government. So what's been going on more recently? Well, in June, notices went out to the State Humanities Council that their grants will be reinstated, but basically at 50% of the original amount. So typically that's 40% of the NEH budget gets granted to the states. Now it's closer to 20%. Also, there's been some big news about the NEH recent grant awards. First of all, there's been a lot of 7 and 8-figure grants awarded that are listed here below. These are thought to have been non-competitive, that they were invitations to apply to the NEH and not necessarily grants but this is just kind of what I've heard within the advocacy industry. I cannot confirm it. $10.4 million, which was the largest grant in the history of the National Endowment for the Arts to the Tikva Foundation, which fights anti-Semitism and is known to be aligned with more conservative groups here in the United States. $10 million to the University of Virginia for American 250 work on founding documents, and then a lot of large gifts to leadership and civic life schools. You can see UNC Chapel Hill School of Civic Life and Leadership Skill recently created School of Civic Leadership at UT Austin, Foundation in Excellence in Higher Education at Princeton, West Point, Ohio State University. These leaderships are institutes and civics programs are by and large things that were recently created to sort of counteract the apparent liberal bias in a lot of higher education. So we're starting to see much more ideological awards coming from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Back in November, Representative Shelley Pingree, who's the ranking member on the committee that actually funds the NEH. She also happens to be the one of the Arts Caucus chairs in the U.S. House. Wrote a letter, particularly about some of the 2 bigger gifts there that came out in September. So there has been some action at the federal level. And what we know now, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that there are 58 staff left at the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a reduction of 73% from their status in November of 2024. Of those, what I've heard is that only about 11 of those are program officers that are administering those grants. So if you think about the massive job of all the grants that go out through these national agencies, 11 folks is pretty small. So pretty lean staffing going on at the NEH. So diving into the NEA, back in March, you guys might remember that the Rhode Island ACLU filed a lawsuit specifically against the NEA because in alliance with an executive order from the president, they had put a ban on funding projects that promote, quote, gender ideology. They asserted that this was a violation of both First and Fifth Amendment rights, as well as the American Procedures Act. Shortly thereafter, the NEA changed their assurance of compliance that they were not going to require that certification in compliance with gender ideology ban, pending the outcome of the litigation. Well, back in September of 2025, the court did come out with their ruling that the NEA had violated both the First Amendment right of the grantees as well as the Administrative Procedure Act, and that the NEA cannot impose a policy disfavoring any grant application for projects that the government believe, quote, promote gender ideology. So that's sort of the progress there. There were lots of twists and turns and ins and outs, but the reality is that gender ideology is no longer listed as something that can't be applied for at the NEA. Other updates at the NEA, they have updated their assurance of compliance, exactly, obviously removing that gender ideology. It says that it does still say that you have to comply with all applicable executive orders. During your award, you cannot operate programs promoting DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, that violate applicable federal anti-discrimination law. Now, the compliance FAQs also make it really clear that it's only illegal DEI that is prohibited. So, no mention of gender at all. And they did post some new grant priorities. I encourage anyone that's applying for an NEA grant to check those out. They're very similar to what the ones that went out on the termination notices for the grants that were terminated or withdrawn earlier in the year. So definitely check those out. But I think they're drawing a line between DEI and illegal DEI. And so as long as you are not violating federal law, and there are some guides we'll talk about later that you can look at to sort of navigate that. Marianne Carter, who had been acting as special counsel and leading the NEA since January 20th of last year, was nominated by the president and confirmed again as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. A lot of the reason that the NEA weathered some of these changes in better shape than IMLS and NEH is because we had that Trump appointee at the NEA. Just to restate, nobody was fired through a reduction in force or any other way at the NEA. They were all either early retirements or deferred resignations. Interesting, those deferred resignations, they were getting paid through September 30th. After Doge left the building in June, we started seeing a lot of NEA staff come back, and they were able to be reemployed up until that salary ran out on September 30th. So there were about 140 staff starting in January before the Trump administration took over. In June, Doge had taken them down to about 75 staff. Now they're roughly at 115 staff. So what happened to the money, the savings from some of those canceled grants and staffing cuts? Well, that was used to keep the staff on during the government shutdown. So while everybody else was not working during the shutdown, a good amount of the staff at the National Endowment for the Arts was working. Just kind of a quick recap, and this was an assessment from directly from Marianne Carter on a call that I was on. Over 500 grants were terminated or withdrawn. So terminated were those grants that technically were already paid out. You didn't have to pay them back, but they were just giving you a statement that they were no longer considering them NEA grants, I suppose, or they withdrawn, which means that they were not paid out in 2025. The appeals process was widely put out there. A lot of folks appealed, and out of those 500 plus, about 100 grants were reinstated. So how does the employment changes within the cultural agencies stack up to the rest of the government? Well, the New York Times put out a really well done article with lots of great charts about all of the employment changes, comparing November 2024 data to November 2025 data. We can see there that 73% cut to the NEH is one of the cuts that they chose to feature and point out in the article. Right up there, only places like the U.S. Agency for International Aid, USAID, took steeper cuts than the NEH. Also, Institute of Museum and Library Services, went from 98 to 40. So we're significant, almost 60% cut there. And you can see that over to the right side of the slide, if you look at kind of the cumulative of all those cultural agencies, overall 56% cut to the cultural agencies, which is one of the biggest cuts. So definitely cultural agencies lost more staff than percentage-wise than a lot of other sections of the government. What section of the government have seen increased hiring? I don't think a big surprise, but certainly Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, ICE, saw a pretty big, almost 30% spike in employment from November 24 to November of 25. So moving on from the federal agencies, I want to talk a little bit about the federal reconciliation bill, also known as the One Big Beautiful Bill or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And I just, several things I want to highlight. This is a very big bill. This is not everything that is in the bill, but just things that I think are going to be most important specifically to nonprofit organizations and the arts. State budgets. So even if states don't specifically decide to supplement some of the cuts, the funding losses for rural hospitals and the increased need for services are sure to strain all budgets in the years ahead. That is inclusive of North Carolina. There are a lot of other factors at play, but as we look at budgets in North Carolina, we are definitely looking at some lean years. This is going to be true of states across the country, both blue and red, for a variety of reasons, but One Big Beautiful Bill certainly being one of them. There were some significant tax changes that happened, and I think it's really important, particularly when it comes to charitable deductions. 90% of tax filers do not itemize. That's back in 2017, they basically doubled the standard deduction that folks can take, which meant that pretty much everybody was just a lot easier, and it didn't make any sense for them to itemize their deduction. They just took the standard deduction. So those non-itemizers now, starting this year, can write off a charitable deduction of up to $1,000 for individual, $2,000 for those filing jointly. This is huge. The nonprofit sector has been looking for this. We've seen significant small gift drop off since 2017 because correlated specifically to that change. And so the nonprofit industry has been advocating for this, and that 1,000, 2,000 is not the highest I have seen. However, it's significantly higher than some of the lower numbers that I had seen proposed. So feeling really good about that. However, there's some pretty big changes to how itemizers can claim charitable deductions. Itemizers now have a 0.5% adjusted gross income floor for charitable deductions. So if you gave if you made $100,000 and chose to itemize, 1% of that it'd be $1,000, and 0.5% of that is $500. So if you gave $1,000, that first $500 you would not be able to claim on your as a charitable deduction. The second $500 you would, right? So that's what that floor means. So any donation made totaling less than that 0.5 is no longer deductible. It starts, you can only deduct things that are over 0.5% of your adjusted gross income. Also, and this is kind of good news, itemizers can give up to 60% of their adjusted gross income for charitable deductions, or can deduct charitable deductions or charitable gifts up to 60% of their AGI. It was 50%. That had been pumped up in 2017, and now that's a permanent change. Pretty big change for corporation too. We were talking about that AGI floor for individual itemizing. Now corporations have 1% of their taxable income floor and a 10% of their taxable income cap. So if a $100 million if a company had $100 million taxable income, and they gave away $1 million, it would not be counted, because that's 1% of their taxable income that they can't deduct. They give away $2 million, they can deduct $1 million of that $2 million, but they can't deduct. If they gave away $12 million, they would only be able to deduct $9 million because of the floor and the 10% cap. Also, pretty significant spending cuts we're going to see. $1.5 trillion for Medicaid and STAP over the next 2 years. You might not think this applies to you, but I just want everyone to be aware, particularly with the Medicare changes. Now, state Medicaid offices need to certify eligibility every 6 months, and folks also need to work or volunteer up to 80 hours each month if they're between 18 and 64. Also, within Medicaid, states can now charge up to 35%. This is not just about the impact that it's going to have on folks. And you might have employees that are on Medicaid and you're not aware of it, maybe some part-time employees. It's not just about how it affects them, but also we are hearing that the work that it is going to take to recertify folks twice a year, plus track all these hours in Medicaid, is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, putting strain on the North Carolina state budget. We're already seeing these conversations take effect. They're not even sure they can get it up and running in time. Changes to SNAP. Again, work requirements 20 hours a week. Benefits are going to be locked at a max of $292 a month for individuals, $975 a month for a family of four, and they are only for U.S. citizens and green card holders. So again, if you start looking at the numbers of how many folks are on Medicaid and SNAP in North Carolina, these are probably people that you know, even if you don't know that they are on Medicaid or SNAP. So also going to be putting big strains on state budgets. Another couple things I want to touch on for federal updates. For those of you that bring in artists, I want to make sure you know this resource, Artists from Abroad. And we're going to have these slides on our webinar page. All of these links will be live, so you can use all of them. Artists from Abroad is a project of a partnership between League of American Orchestras and Association for Performing Arts Professionals, that many of you know as APAP, and really is the best place for guidance and up-to-date information and news about what is happening for those of you particularly that are presenters that are bringing folks in, artists in on visas. We're seeing new travel bans are being expanded for different countries. That's going to affect you. Priority PPS, which is priority processing service. The costs on that are skyrocketing, and honestly, it's really the only option, because if you're not paying for priority processing, it is taking months and months and months to get visas. So in the performing arts world, those costs are going up. They're changing addresses for filing for O&P visa petitions. Also, consular interviews now have to take place in the country of residence. And for those of you that have artists that are from abroad, you can certainly imagine how difficult that can be, and all of the additional work that's caused by that. Also, just Fix the Tick, great resource by National Independent Venues Association. I will say that, President Trump ordered an executive order back on March 31st of last year, directing the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, to create a live ticket reform report. It was due on September 27th. We have not seen it yet, but we are continuing to keep an eye out for that report. It also really encouraged the FTC to start going after illegal ticket resale and deceptive pricing, and the Bots Act, which is what keeps using computers to buy up more tickets than you're allowed to. And the FTC is doing that. We're seeing there's a suit. FTC is going after Ticketmaster, Live Nation, over illegal ticket resale practices. We're seeing some other enforcement across the FTC that is broadly in line with the NEVA requests, particularly around the secondary market and the Bots Act. There's also a lot of legislative initiatives that are happening across the country, including North Carolina, and I will talk about that a little later on. So executive orders, lots of things that are going on at the executive level. I want to run through them sort of at a high level. There was a memo that came out withdrawing the United States from international organizations, conventions, and treaties, contrary to the interest of the United States. There were dozens. I want to say it was close to 80 or over 80 organizations that we pulled out of. This came from an executive order in the spring of last year. Part of that executive order told the Secretary of State to write a report about whether or not we needed to be in these organizations and whether or not they aligned with the administration's goals. So that report came out, and as a result, this memo came out ordering us to pull out of these groups. So in terms of the arts, we've been the U.S. has removed itself from the International Federation of Arts Councils and Cultural Agencies and the International Center for the Study and Preservation of and Restoration of Culture. I will also say from kind of from my colleagues that do the federal stuff and have been working within the federal government a while. These are groups that administrations on both sides of the aisle have not particularly engaged in at a high level, and we certainly have not availed ourselves of these groups to a significant amount. However, I think actually pulling the United States out of them sends a pretty significant signal. But I wanted to give a little bit of context there. President Trump, and who chairs the board of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, that board voted to change the name of the Kennedy Center. So now it is the Donald Trump and the John F. Kennedy Performing Arts Center. I will say that the Kennedy Center was created by an act of Congress, which named it the Kennedy Center. There is a lot of debate about whether or not the board can vote to change the name. You can see in that image there that the sign has gone up, adding the president's name above the Kennedy Center name. But that is something that's going on, has seen a lot of press. And obviously there's a lot of news around which artists will or won't perform at the Kennedy Center for a lot of different reasons. There's also been some executive orders around increased prosecution for the burning of the American flag, rules around executive order, rules around making federal architecture beautiful again, kind of going with that very classical architecture for government buildings. This actually was also an executive order that President Trump put out in his first administration, so very similar there. Also, there was a memo that really just restated laws that were already on the books. President is to prevent the use of federal grants for political lobbying. Well, federal grant funds were always, you could not use them for political lobbying. However, I think that this memo was put out to sort of those nonprofits who get federal grants can hire lobbyists, they can advocate. All of this is very clearly spelled out in the law. They just can't use their federal grant dollars for political lobbying. But I think this was put out to sort of throw some confusion into that and maybe scare off some organizations that get federal grants but also do lobbying. There was an order that went out, an executive order improving oversight of federal grant making. That basically says that all federal grants are going to have somebody that's a political appointee of the Trump administration looking over it before it goes out. And also, and this might be one that you guys might want to follow up on, which is Department of Justice guidance for those that receive federal funding regarding unlawful discrimination, particularly those DEI policies. And we talked about legal versus illegal immigration. So, definitely, if you have a lawyer on your board, I would lean on them. But if you don't, it might not be a bad idea to look at that DOJ guidance. And also, the greatest hits of executive orders from the spring, the combating unfair ticket practices or practices in the live event market. We already talked about that. That did a lot of good, but also ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, which we know is the DEI executive order, and the executive order there about gender ideology. So, I like to put all of those together. So hopefully you can use this slide as a reference. All those links should be live in the PDF that'll be on the website. Now, I do know that a lot of folks, want to act. I get a lot of questions about how artists can engage in this work. Certainly, we engage Congress. We and I've got to say that the fact that the NEA and the NEH and the MLS all saw level funding, right? There was a lot of green on that chart. That was because of advocacy. That was the letter writing and the emails and the phone calls and the meetings. That is vital. That's the kind of advocacy that Arts NC produces. But I know that there are a lot of different things going on, a lot of different opinions, and artists might want to get engaged in other forms of activism to a certain extent. Now, I do have my friends at Arts Workers United. You have put out some artivist toolkits. I will say that it was created specifically in partnership with the No Kings protest. So if I could find art specific things so that I could give you that were for more conservative causes, I could make those available so you could have your choice of them. But these are the tools that were available specifically targeted to audience artists. So if the No Kings protest is not your cup of tea, then I caution you about that. These might rub against you a little bit. But primarily, these toolkits are really about using art as an act of nonviolent protest. And how do we bring art into that activism and the protesting and the demonstration? Also, stressing the importance of joy and art in activism. So, I think it's really important that as we're having these conversations and as the temperature sort of rises and falls across the nation, that artists have a way, and I wanted to make sure that these resources were available to you. So moving on, and then we'll have some time for questions. I'm sure there might be one or two. I know the big question of the hour is, why doesn't North Carolina have a budget? We are the only state in the nation that didn't pass a budget last year. And so there's really two reasons, but I want to talk about the first one yet, which is a disagreement around tax policy. And it's a little bit more complicated than what I've got pointed out here, but it's really a disagreement between the Senate and the House. The Senate wants to enact in 2026 a planned reduction for personal income tax. It is currently 4.25. They want to take it down to 3.99. This is part of a bill that passed 2.5 years ago. And what it said was that as long as we brought in $32 billion in overall state revenue, that would trigger this tax cut. Well, back in FY25, we already brought in 34.5 billion. So that's almost assured to be triggered this year, and that we would see this tax cut, and that's part of the budget. The House, however, is looking at some projections, and there's several out there that say that we are heading off a fiscal cliff. I thought about grabbing some screen images of Thelma and Louise to illustrate this point, but I think you get the idea. That basically, if we enact this tax cut, that we're going to start spending more than we're bringing in, and cause some real problems in the government. I will say that the Senate is, that there have been similar projections about tax cuts leading to fiscal cliffs in the past that did not work out that way. And the Senate points to those and says, we don't believe that this is actually going to happen. The House is like, we think this time it's serious. And they would like to raise that trigger up to 36 billion at least before they enact that next tax cut. That is not to say that the House is against tax cuts. That's just to say that they want to be a little bit more cautious about when and how they enact it. The House is also looking to find other ways to lower property tax burdens. So that's something particularly my nonprofit friends should keep an eye on, because they're looking at ways of adjusting local property taxes. Not only is that going to cut into municipal monies for city and county work, but they are talking about whether or not nonprofits that don't pay taxes should be paying taxes. Most of those government-owned properties or properties owned by nonprofits in that calculation are either government-owned or owned by hospitals, right? Like, so those are it is not the small little art center that they're going after, but we're continuing to work with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits in order to make sure that nonprofits stay out of the mix of this property tax, and we'll keep you updated on that throughout the year. So that's one of the big disagreements between the budget. The other thing that's holding up the budget right now is that primary elections for a whole host of offices, but particularly for the North Carolina General Assembly, are happening on March 3rd. March 3rd. I think there might be, like, you can count on your fingers the amount of races that are going to be close, that are really at play in the general election in November. But there are a lot of races where an incumbent could lose to a primary challenger. So these incumbents, both Democrats and Republicans, but particularly Republicans that are in charge, they're much more vulnerable in the primary election if budget cuts are going to be made, if changes are going to be made to tax cuts. These are things that primary challengers could use against them. And certainly something that incumbents might want to wait until after the primary election is over before they take action on it. In particular, there's one really close race that could be holding this up, but really either way is something that the whole state is going to be watching. Senate Leader Pro Tem Phil Berger, who has been the Republican leader for over 20 years, and has been the leader of the entire Senate since 2011. Is in a very close primary against Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page, who has been the sheriff in Rockingham County since 1998. So obviously a well-known factor in Rockingham County. It is an extremely close race, and depending on the day, we don't know who is going to win. President Trump has endorsed Senator Berger. However, Senator Berger was trying to push forward some casinos about a year or so ago. And there was a lot of pushback from in Rockingham County where one of those casinos was going to go, and that sort of created this opening where Sam Page is railing against that, amongst other things. So really tight race there. So we'll certainly be watching that on March 3rd. As a result, we are not going to see a state budget until they come back in April for the session at the earliest. Okay. I mean, and I do mean at the earliest. It could be May. It could be June before we see a budget. But the hope is that they will come to some agreement. Probably not a whole lot of negotiation because of the tight coffers in terms of amounts. But I want to talk a little bit about our goals and where that stands. So, goal number one, we want to make sure that all 100 counties get funding from the North Carolina Arts Council Grassroots Arts Program grants. As of right now, Tier 3 counties, it's an economic grant tier. There's always 20 Tier 3, the most stable economic counties, the 40 Tier 2 and 40 Tier 1. Tier 1 being the least economically robust counties. So those counties that are the most economically healthy are Tier 3. Those Tier 3 counties with populations over 250 are currently excluded from receiving any share of a portion that is about 40% of the grassroots, of the total grassroots allocation, the 2.5 million out of $6.3 million. So there's no fix for this currently in either budget proposal from the House or the budget proposal from the Senate. Initially, when this took effect back in 2023 or FY24, Buncombe, Durham, Mecklenburg, Wake, and Union counties were all excluded. Last year for FY26, the funding also was excluded, both Johnson and Cabarrus counties, because they were always had been Tier 3 counties, but their populations went over 250,000. They each lost over $70,000. In the numbers right now, looking for FY27, if it's not fixed in this coming session, New Hanover County down there by Wilmington, or with Wilmington, it is not fixed. They're going to lose over $74,000 because their population went over 250,000 in the official state estimates. Buncombe County is now a Tier 2 because of the damage from Helene. Their economic stability is not what it was. They will be included in the new numbers, regardless of if there's change. That's $81,000. Obviously, this is bad policy. This funding goes to every county. helps support the arts, it provides stability in a way that has allowed us to grow the most comprehensive network of arts councils in the entire country. When we start seeing counties lose and gain funding based off factors that have nothing to do with arts growth or support in that county, we need a much more equitable system. That's why we're doing it. The most recent fix we're going to see is that population cap increasing, probably to include more counties, maybe as much as 97 or 98 counties, but it probably won't be 100. Specifically, if there's counties excluded, they will be larger ones whose representatives are largely Democrats, and that is politics, unfortunately. But we are going to continue to work to do everything that we can to get more counties until we have 100 counties receiving their share of all the funds. Conversations are continuing for fixes in FY27. We are also getting reports that it might not be able to get fixed until FY28, but we are continuing to work on this issue. Also, one that we're working on because it doesn't require any additional spending. I'll say we're maintaining our goal for relief for the arts in Western North Carolina. At this point, we're not asking for specific numbers, but we want to make sure that nonprofits, and particularly arts nonprofit, but all arts and creative businesses are included in relief programs, especially those small businesses. We want to make sure that any opportunity for art support in Helene recovery efforts, that we're helping to advance that. There were no relief for nonprofits or businesses in the Disaster Recovery Act Part 2. That was the last big piece of recovery legislation back in June. And so we're hoping to see something in the next session. The House is very serious about keeping it separate from the budget, so it probably would move separately. Another goal, try and make recurring that $750,000 for A+ schools we saw for a few years. There was a private foundation that was matching up to $250 for an FY20, or matching up to $500,000 for an FY26 allocation. The private foundation is considering right now support for FY27. We're kind of waiting to hear back from those conversations. This allocation is not currently in either the House or the Senate budget proposal from last year. But we're continuing to have those conversations. Also, we're going to continue our goal for increased funding, particularly closing that funding gap between requests and funds for North Carolina general grants. We have not seen an increase in this program for 15 years. Also, neither one of these are currently in the House and Senate budget. So, Nate, is there any good news? Yes, we do have some. We will say that the performing and visual arts requirement, as you guys have probably heard me talk about before, 1 in every 20 elementary school students in the state don't have both art and music. We are moving legislation that would require every one of those students to have both performing arts and visual arts, each of those for 30 minutes every 5 instructional days, from a certified licensed instructor in that subject in a standard classroom size of students. There was a $250+ million allocation that was enacted and has been phased in since 2018 for program enhancement teachers, which includes these performing and visual arts teachers. And this is included in the House budget proposal. So we are working to see that is included in the final budget proposal between the House and the Senate. Hopefully we will see that in April or May. Also, we are working on legislation to curb fraudulent and misleading ticket sales. We've got support from the North Carolina Presenters Consortium, the North Carolina Theater Conference, the National Independent Venue Association, as well as independent venues here in North Carolina. Last session, we were able to stop a really harmful bill for the industry, H598, before it reached the House floor. I was honored to be able to speak out against that bill at several committee hearings. Currently, we are working on a plan to release some new legislation in April of this year in the new session. Leaders on this are our Arts Caucus Chair, Senator Chaudhry and Senator Sawyer. We're hoping that we might try and launch this with a press conference in the spring at a Raleigh independently owned venue near the North Carolina General Assembly. honored a few weeks ago to present to a gathering of the North Carolina Independent Venue Association members here in North Carolina. They met up in Saxapaw. The North Carolina Secretary of Natural and Cultural Resources, Pam Cashwell, spoke about her department and the North Carolina Music Office. Jeff Bell, Executive Director of North Carolina Arts Council, also talked about the North Carolina Music Office and his willingness to work with those independent venues. I talked about our work with tickets, and we're really excited to have those independent venues owners as a for-profit on this ticket sale legislation as partners, as well as some other possible legislation as we move into the future. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about what this crazy ticket bill says, here's a bunch of smiley faces. And yes, I created this slide when I was up against the bad ticket bill. So that had a bunch of frowny faces. But really, it bans all speculative sales. Upfront ticket pricing is now the law of the land here in North Carolina, but it bans all speculative sales. Pre-sale has to be authorized by the primary seller. Resellers cannot access pre-sold tickets through fan clubs, bans misleading URLs, must have primary seller permission to use logo and images. Resellers clearly and conspicuously state that they are not the primary sellers. Resellers, and this is one that I haven't seen in any other laws across the country, resellers must provide a web link to the primary seller, and it also bans the use of bots and other methods to buy more tickets than permitted. So what can you do to help advance this? Well, first of all, go to artsnc.org, get signed up for our email. I'm guessing everybody on this webinar probably is, but also Arts Day 2026 is coming up May 12th and 13th. So we're not sure what the budget's going to look like, changing political climates, probably be announcing our official agenda and goals late because of all the changes and last minute dealings in this particular situation. But we do plan on opening registration in March. So please get signed up for our emails and be keeping an eye out. Also, sponsorships are still available, which is the great way to be recognized and also support Arts North Carolina, and also comes with registration benefits that'll get you to Arts Day 2026. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions on the federal budgets and the agencies, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, immigration, ticketing, executive orders, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll go ahead and stop my share and see if we've got any questions.
Yep. Please put your questions in the chat. So we've
Great
got
question. Let's see. What can we do to reinstate NEH staff? So I will say, check out the National Alliance for the Humanities. We've done some talking to Congress. Unfortunately, there is not a really good avenue to advocate to the administration. That said, and they are the ones that made these cuts. There are still lawsuits pending. Obviously, there's not much we can do with lawsuits. Advocating to the administration is probably not going to gain a ton of traction. I would also say that, if these things matter to you, you can always put them on a sign and join in some of these protests where a lot of aspects of the federal government are being criticized. If you want to criticize that, you can talk about it that way. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of other priorities in that messaging. So anyway, that was the NEH staff. I know that's not a great answer because there's not much that can be done. But I think that really where we are is we're just trying to make sure that these agencies hold on to, that they continue to exist throughout this disruptive time. And even if they don't look exactly like we want them to. What other questions do we have?
It says, will the legislature be looking at passing a budget for FY27 separate from maybe passing a budget, the FY26 budget?
Great question. So North Carolina typically always passes a 2-year budget, and they should have passed a 2-year budget last session that should have started on July 1st of 2025. That would have gone through June 30th of this year, and actually again all the way through FY27. So the budget that we will pass this session will be for both FY26 and FY27. That is all but guaranteed. I don't want to guarantee anything because this is definitely a anything can happen kind of year. It seems like already, but as we certainly expect to see a 26 budget and a 27 budget passed as one, and then we will start the process over again in January of 27. Any other questions further up?
And you need to let everybody know I've put the link in the chat to our page that will have the slides and the recording on it as soon as the slides will be up there pretty soon, probably this afternoon. The recording will be done as soon as the captions and things are edited. There's an older question here, and I think it has something to do with that executive order about lobbying. It says, what can we do to continue lobbying with nonprofits?
So I'll tackle that lobbying question first, and then I'll get to the corporate income tax. So in terms of the lobbying question, continue to stay informed with your advocacy organizations. Obviously, Arts North Carolina, we're not going to ask you to do anything that would go against those laws, and we will certainly ask you to do those things that would support your right to lobby for nonprofits, etc. I also encourage all nonprofits to get on the mailing list and be a member of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. I will say that as I talk to other folks across the state, I'll never forget the person, someone from Arizona that used to run the Arizona Arts Council. He was like, yeah, used to run the Arizona Center for Nonprofits. And he was like, everybody wanted to, all the other nonprofit organizations, they wanted to be like North Carolina because you guys just do such a great job. So definitely be tracking. We're going to be focusing more on the art specific, but those big nonprofit issues, we rely heavily on David Heinen and the work of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, and we encourage and help support that work as well in our advocacy and lobbying. In terms of the state corporate tax, that yes, it is slated to opt down to zero. I'm not as familiar with that as well. I don't know whether or not that would be put on pause as well. It might be part of what the negotiation is, because that was stepped down off the same triggers. So if they do change the trigger, it may be for the corporate as well. I don't have the specific answer for that, but it is certainly possible that would be all part of the same package. Any other questions?
We've got a few thank yous for your job of doing this.
Everyone, I want to thank you I cannot believe that I actually got through all of this with 2 minutes to spare. A lot of things going on. We'll continue to advocate. We'll continue to track all of these things as we move forward. Also, I work very closely. I'm now, for those who don't know, one of the 3 co-chairs of the Creative States Coalition. And so that's all the state and local advocacy organization for arts and arts education. So we are continuing to have conversations about how to work together in this very disruptive time for our industry and for our nation. And please stay tuned and make sure you're checking your Arts NC emails. And I hope to see each and every one of you at Arts Day 2026 on May 12th and 13th. Thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon.